June 20th, 1943. North of the Solomon Islands, a green fireball fell from the morning sky, its twin engines trailing smoke as it sliced through thin cloud. The aircraft hit the lagoon with a muted roar, broke apart, and floated in pieces across the shallow water. Within hours, a Navy patrol boat was dispatched from Rendova Island. The wreck was unlike anything the American crew had seen. Streamlined, elegant, and impossibly light, it barely seemed real. As if designed for beauty, not war. Stenciled across the shattered fuselage, Mitsubishi G4M-1, the Imperial Japanese Navy's primary land-based bomber. Allied intelligence already knew its codename, Betty. For months, pilots across the Pacific had cursed that name. The Betty had delivered the torpedoes that sank the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse off Malaya in 1941, the first time in history the battleships had been destroyed by air power while maneuvering at sea. She had carried Admiral Yamamoto himself on the fatal flight that ended with his death over Bougainville. The Betty was fast, long-legged, and, as every Allied airman knew, dangerously flammable. It was said that a single tracer round could ignite her like dry paper. What the Americans didn't understand was why. The recovered wreck near Rendova was the first mostly intact Betty ever captured. Within days, U.S. Navy engineers and intelligence officers gathered at a makeshift hangar on Guadalcanal to examine it. They expected crude workmanship, the result of Japan's supposedly inferior industry. What they found instead was something that defied their assumptions about Japanese engineering, an aircraft built with obsessive attention to detail, but with choices that seemed suicidal. Lieutenant Commander George B. Raymond of the Naval Air Technical Intelligence Center wrote in his first report, "The airframe construction is excellent, light, precise, with first-rate riveting, yet it lacks any form of self-sealing protection for the fuel tanks. All 6 tanks are integral to the wings, unlined and without armor. The result is inevitable destruction from even minor combat damage. This is not oversight, it is design philosophy." The engineers began disassembly. The skin of the Betty was thin, almost delicate. Aluminum alloy 7075, lightweight and smooth, only 1.2 millimeters thick in some places. The spars were narrow and gracefully curved. The fuselage cross-section almost circular for aerodynamic efficiency. Every rivet was flush. Every panel fitted tight. The Japanese designers had sacrificed everything, armor, redundancy, safety, for range and speed. The Betty was built to fly far, strike hard, and never get hit. On paper, the logic was impeccable. Japan's Pacific Empire spanned more than 6,000 miles. Its islands were scattered across vast distances where fuel was precious and airfields rare. The Navy demanded a bomber that could reach those distances, 3,000 kilometers without refueling, while carrying torpedoes capable of crippling a battleship. In 1939, engineer Kiro Honjo of Mitsubishi had delivered exactly that. The G4M's 2 Mitsubishi Kasei 11 radial engines produced 1,530 horsepower each, driving the plane to 265 miles per hour at 16,000 feet. That was faster than most Allied twin-engine bombers in 1941, and it could carry an 800-pound torpedo over 1,000 miles. But there was a price. The Betty carried nearly 1,200 gallons of fuel distributed across its wings, all in unprotected tanks that formed part of the wing structure itself. The slightest puncture from gunfire turned the aircraft into a torch, and once alight, there was no stopping it. Vaporized fuel fed the flames faster than any extinguisher could contain. Pilots nicknamed it the one-shot lighter. When American engineers cut into the wing structure at Guadalcanal, they realized something shocking. There wasn't even room for armor. Every structural element was optimized to the millimeter. Adding protective liners or self-sealing rubber would have increased weight by hundreds of pounds, enough to reduce range below the Navy's requirement. In other words, the vulnerability wasn't an error. It was deliberate engineering compromise. As one naval analyst summarized in his report, the Betty was designed with the assumption of Japanese air superiority. The Imperial Navy's doctrine before Midway assumed that enemy fighters would rarely intercept their long-range bombers. Japan's air arms had swept across the Pacific unchallenged in 1941 and 1942, destroying Allied aircraft on the ground and dominating the skies. Under such conditions, speed and range mattered more than armor. Survivability came from not being caught. When the Americans opened the cockpit, they were struck by the craftsmanship. The pilot's seat was riveted aluminum, with no armor plate behind it. The instrument layout was orderly, with precision dials and finely machined levers. The control yokes were leather-wrapped, the throttle quadrant elegantly milled. There was no crude improvisation. Everything looked carefully thought out, until one realized what was missing. No cockpit armor, no bullet-resistant glass, no armored bulkhead behind the radio operator. Even the oxygen tanks were unprotected, thin aluminum cylinders directly behind the pilot. Lieutenant Frank LeMay, one of the test pilots assigned to evaluate captured enemy aircraft, summed it up during a briefing. "This thing flies like a dream, but it dies like a candle." During taxi tests, American pilots were astonished by the Betty's grace. The engines ran smooth, controls were light, and takeoff distance short. Fully loaded, the bomber lifted off in just over 1,000 feet, impressive for its size. In flight, the Betty handled beautifully. Its large wings gave high lift and gentle stall behavior. It could climb at 1,500 feet per minute and cruise efficiently at 210 miles per hour. But even mild turbulence caused the thin fuselage to flex visibly. One engineer noted that the entire structure quivers under stress like a violin string. Back in the intelligence office, analysts compared the Betty to American aircraft of similar class, the B-25 Mitchell and B-26 Marauder. Both were heavier by several tons, armored around crew stations, and equipped with self-sealing fuel tanks lined with vulcanized rubber layers that expanded when exposed to gasoline, sealing bullet holes. These systems added hundreds of pounds but saved lives daily. The Betty had none. To American minds, it was inconceivable. One intelligence officer tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the Japanese lacked access to self-sealing materials. But chemical analysis of captured wreckage disproved that. Japanese industry did possess such materials. They were used on the heavier G4M-1 and later versions of the Zero fighter. The omission on the Betty then was not technological incapability, but conscious sacrifice. The captured example was later shipped to Wright Field in Ohio, where U.S. Army Air Force's experts conducted more detailed evaluation. They stripped it to the bones, measuring every spar, every rivet, every control linkage. The conclusion was unanimous. It was a masterpiece of lightweight engineering and a monument to flawed assumptions. American engineers marveled at the Betty's aerodynamic cleanliness. Its fuselage drag coefficient was lower than that of most U.S. bombers. Its smooth skin and tightly faired engines allowed remarkable fuel efficiency. On paper, it was brilliant, but in combat, physics and doctrine collided with reality. Allied fighters from 1943 onward, P-38 Lightnings, F-4U Corsairs, and P-47 Thunderbolts, tore through formations of Bettys with ease. Machine gun fire ignited their wings long before their defensive guns could respond. Crews often perished without firing a shot. The autopsies of wrecked Bettys told grimly consistent stories. Wings sheared off mid-air, crew burned alive, fuel tanks exploding in seconds. Post-battle photographs often showed the aircraft reduced to skeletons of charred aluminum. Fuselages melted away, but tails still intact, drifting down like burning kites. The Americans realized they were facing not incompetence, but a completely different philosophy of warfare, one that prized performance over protection, obedience over survivability. When a test pilot from Wright Field flew the restored Betty in late 1944, he described the experience in a single line in his logbook, "A beautiful death trap." At right field, the Betty sat under blinding hangar lights surrounded by engineers, intelligence officers, and pilots. Its green paint, once vibrant in the Pacific sun, had dulled from salt and fire. Across its wings, faint scorch marks traced, where .50 caliber rounds had sliced through the skin. The wreck had been meticulously reassembled. One engine replaced, controls repaired, wiring traced and labeled. The Americans treated it like a riddle carved from aluminum. Colonel Albert Boyd, one of the Air Force's best test pilots, circled the plane during the first inspection. "It looks like a racing airplane, not a bomber," he remarked. His team nodded. The G4M's lines were beautiful, tapered, balanced, efficient. But to the Americans trained on overbuilt bombers like the B-17 and B-24, it seemed absurdly fragile. The examination started with weight calculations. Fully loaded, the Betty came in at just over 18,700 pounds. A B-25 of similar range weighed nearly 30,000. That difference wasn't magic. It was armor, structure, and self-sealing tanks that the Japanese had abandoned to save every possible pound. Engineers weighed the tail surfaces and found the horizontal stabilizer skin so thin that a man could dent it with his thumb. Inside the fuselage, the crew compartment felt strangely open. No armor bulkheads, no floor plating, no protective padding around fuel lines. Everything was exposed, naked to gunfire. The Americans traced the fuel system, 6 integral wing tanks, totaling 1,150 gallons, feeding 2 engines through unshielded aluminum tubing. No shut-off valves between tanks. A single hit anywhere could drain or ignite them all. Major William R. Kellogg, a structural engineer, shook his head. "They didn't even give it a chance," he said quietly. Intelligence reports from the Pacific had already painted the Betty's reputation in blood. Pilots called them flying Zippos because once hit, they erupted into pillars of fire visible for miles. A Marine ace joked grimly, "You don't shoot down a Betty, you just light it." At right field, analysts wanted to understand why the Japanese had persisted with such a design, even after catastrophic losses. They interviewed captured Japanese airmen who described the same doctrine again and again: attack first, strike hard, never get caught. Imperial Navy planners had believed that an aircraft's best armor was distance, the ability to reach a target others could not. Documents recovered from Rabaul confirmed this mindset. Operational orders emphasized range over survivability. Crews were expected to accept losses as part of the mission. The Japanese command viewed air crews not as irreplaceable specialists, but as extensions of the weapon. Sacrifice was expected. When American engineers performed flight tests, they discovered how seductive that philosophy must have been in 1941. The Betty's controls were feather-light. It responded instantly to aileron and rudder. The big Kasei engines pulled smoothly, climbing to 20,000 feet in under 10 minutes. Cruising at 230 miles per hour, it burned fuel with astonishing efficiency, barely 100 gallons per hour. For long overwater missions, that performance was revolutionary. But as Boyd noted after the second flight, every minute you're airborne, you're gambling that nobody's shooting back. To quantify the danger, the team conducted a live fire simulation. A retired B-25 sat beside the Betty in a remote corner of the field. Technicians rigged both with test panels of their respective fuel systems and loaded them with aviation gasoline dyed red. From a distance of 400 yards, an Army gunner fired controlled bursts from a Browning .50 caliber. The B-25 panel absorbed the hits. Gasoline sprayed, the self-sealing liners swelled, and within seconds the leak stopped. The fuel caught fire briefly but extinguished itself as pressure dropped. Then they fired at the Betty's panel. The first burst turned it into a torch. Flames raced along the seams, following vapor lines like a fuse. Within 30 seconds, the entire panel melted. "We didn't have to fire twice," one engineer noted. "It was gone." The test confirmed what pilots had long known. The Betty's design made it a suicide pact. Even the oxygen system was a hazard. Thin aluminum bottles that exploded when heated. The more the Americans studied the aircraft, the more they realized that the Japanese had built a machine not to survive war, but to win quickly before war became attrition. In 1941, that gamble might have seemed rational. Japanese victories from the Philippines to Malaya had relied on lightning strikes, not sustained campaigns. A bomber that could cross the Pacific gaps without refueling fit perfectly. It didn't need to survive dozens of missions, just enough to break enemy fleets before resistance organized. By 1943, that logic collapsed. The Allies had radar, long-range fighters, and superior production. What had been an asset, speed and reach, became meaningless when survival odds dropped below 50%. Japanese crews knew it too. Interrogations revealed that pilots referred to the G4M bitterly as hamaki, the cigar. They joked grimly that they'd be smoked before they landed. Wright Field's engineers compiled their final report in October 1944. It ran 142 pages and read like an autopsy of a philosophy. The summary section was blunt. The G4M exemplifies an extreme trait of endurance for range. In engineering terms, it is elegant. In combat terms, it is fatal. The enemy's design reflects a doctrine of initiative without protection, strategic reach achieved at the cost of tactical survival. The data sheets were sent to aircraft designers at North American, Boeing, and Lockheed. The comparisons influenced post-war thinking about survivability versus performance. The Americans concluded that range alone could not guarantee success. Redundancy and armor were as decisive as horsepower. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The Betty's brilliance as an airframe made it a technical marvel, but its perfection had killed its crews. Still, intelligence officers wanted to know how Japan had achieved such efficiency. They dissected the Keisei engines, noting meticulous craftsmanship, tight tolerances, hand-fit bearings, excellent metallurgy. The Americans respected that quality. "They're not primitive," one engineer wrote. "They're purposeful." They examined the wing spars, beautifully milled, thin yet strong. The Japanese had used extrusion techniques ahead of their time, shaping aluminum spars into continuous curves to save weight. If that talent had been applied to a sturdier design, the results could have rivaled American bombers. But the doctrine behind it doomed them. In Tokyo, planners believed that the bomber's defense lay in its offensive reach. The concept worked until American P-38S and Corsairs extended their patrol ranges. Then Betty formations became easy prey. The Americans could now strike at the very doctrine the aircraft embodied. At Wright Field, after the final test flight, Colonel Boyd logged one last comment. "If they'd armored it, it would have lost the very thing that makes it unique. But if they hadn't built it at all, we might never have learned how fragile certainty can be." The Betty would fly again, but only in tests. No pilot volunteered to take it into mock combat. Even empty, the aircraft unnerved them. They had seen what tracer rounds could do to its paper-thin skin. In early 1945, the captured G4M was moved to storage. Technicians painted "Examined Attic" on its tail and covered it in protective canvas. The hangar doors closed, ending the chapter, but the lesson didn't. Every pilot who read the report came away with the same thought. The enemy had built beauty without mercy, for themselves most of all. By early 1944, the lessons from Wright Field had already filtered into combat briefings across the Pacific. American pilots were told exactly where to aim. The intelligence circulars printed in black and red diagrams showed the Betty's weak spots. The broad upper wing routes where fuel tanks overlapped. The engine nacelles with exposed fuel lines. The thin belly skin that could be penetrated even by .30 caliber fire. "Aim here," one manual advised, "and you will see results immediately." They did. In the skies over Rabaul and Truk, Betty formations that once terrified convoys now burned before reaching torpedo range. P-38S would climb above them, roll inverted, and dive through their formations, firing short bursts. It took only 1 or 2 strikes to send an entire bomber spiraling down in flames. Navy pilots learned to hold fire until they could see the fuselage panels shimmer from heat, then break away fast to avoid the fireball. For the men inside those Bettys, it became a ritual of inevitability. Survivors told interrogators that crews carried wet towels to cover their faces, knowing that a hit to the wings meant seconds before explosion. Some tied handkerchiefs around their throats, hoping to avoid choking on smoke. In post-war accounts, Japanese gunners spoke of hearing bullets strike the wings like rain on bamboo and feeling heat rise through the cockpit floor. The beautiful machine had become a pyre. At the same time, American analysts tried to understand why Japanese command continued to use the design long after its flaws were known. They intercepted dispatches showing that Mitsubishi had proposed modifications: armored seats, self-sealing liners, heavier defensive guns. The Navy rejected them all. Each pound added meant lost range, and range remained the sacred metric of Japanese doctrine. To change it would have meant rewriting the Imperial Navy's entire operational theory. The decision condemned thousands. When the Allies invaded the Marianas in mid-1944, long-range Betty units were ordered to attack Saipan and Tinian. Out of 92 aircraft launched, only 12 returned. The rest vanished in fire and sea spray. The official Japanese communique praised heroic sacrifice. American pilots just shook their heads. "They're still flying those lighters," one Corsair pilot radioed after watching 3 burn in one pass. Back in Washington, air technical intelligence officers analyzed the results. The Betty's catastrophic losses illustrated what they called the fatal purity of design. When engineering pursues one objective so perfectly that it destroys all others. Range without armor, speed without protection, efficiency without resilience. It was a lesson no spreadsheet could quantify, but every survivor understood. Field reports poured in from captured airfields. In New Guinea, engineers found burned Betty wrecks lined up neatly on the edge of the jungle, charred skeletons with aluminum puddled around the landing gear. The fuel had burned so hot it melted rivets. Yet inside the wreckage, instruments remained precise. Levers still moved smoothly, proof of meticulous craftsmanship. In one wreck near Hollandia, they found something that haunted investigators: a neat handwritten label above the fuel gauge reading, in Japanese, "Glory is fleeting, duty is eternal." It summed up the mentality that had produced the aircraft. As Allied production surged, the contrast grew unbearable for Japanese planners. In the same month that American factories built 2,300 B-24S and B-25S, Mitsubishi managed only 120 G4Ms, most destroyed before delivery. Raw material shortages forced them to use lower-grade alloys. Fuel lines began to leak. Tanks ruptured during test flights. But orders continued. Build more Bettys. Doctrine was inertia with wings. At sea, the consequences were brutal. Carrier task groups learned to use radar to vector fighters toward incoming raids. The first blip that appeared on the screen often meant a Betty formation, low and fast over the waves. On destroyer decks, sailors would shout, "Betty's inbound," and the sky would fill with tracers. Those who made it close enough to release torpedoes were torn apart by anti-aircraft fire before they could pull away. After each battle, fragments of Bettys washed ashore, propeller hubs, scorched tail sections, sometimes whole wings still floating because the internal tanks trapped air. Marines used them as makeshift piers. Psychologically, the Betty came to symbolize the Japanese war effort itself, brilliantly conceived, beautifully executed, and doomed by refusal to adapt. American intelligence summaries described it that way explicitly. The G4M-1 memo stated, "is an aircraft that demonstrates the danger of engineering perfection pursued without operational humility." By late 1944, Japanese commanders finally approved a new model, the G4M-3. It had self-sealing tanks and armor plating. It was heavier, slower, and arrived too late. Only a few dozen reached operational units before the war ended. They burned just as quickly when hit by radar-guided fighters or naval flak. In American training lectures, instructors used the Betty to teach design philosophy. Charts compared it to the B-17 and B-24, showing how small penalties in performance had yielded massive gains in survivability. A B-17 could return home with half its tail missing and a dead engine. A Betty could not survive a single bullet through the wing root. Students were told, "This is why you build for damage, not dreams." The test aircraft at Wright Field, now grounded, became an educational exhibit. Mechanics were allowed to examine it, to run their fingers along the paper-thin skin, to see where the fuel tanks were part of the wing itself. "That's not a tank," one trainee said, tapping the metal. "That's a coffin." Engineers from Lockheed and Boeing quietly admired the Japanese aerodynamic efficiency. They copied some aspects, flush riveting, narrow engine cowlings, but combined them with redundancy and armor. Out of that synthesis would come the next generation of American bombers. The Betty's tragedy improved its enemy's machines. On the Japanese side, desperation deepened. By 1945, G4Ms were among the aircraft modified for TOCO, kamikaze missions. The bomber that once carried torpedoes now carried men who were torpedoes. Engineers removed guns, added explosives, and sent them on one-way flights against Allied fleets. It was the final expression of the same logic that had built the unarmored fuel tanks. Victory through sacrifice. American sailors who watched those flaming aircraft dive toward their ships felt both fear and pity. They knew those machines by silhouette now. The long, narrow fuselage, the glazed nose, the fragile beauty. "Poor devils," one gunner wrote in his diary after shooting one down near Okinawa. "They burn like paper lanterns." The intelligence reports closed the case. The Betty's design, born from confidence, had become a symbol of collapse. Yet in the archives, one handwritten note from a Wright Field engineer summed up the contradiction. You can almost respect them for believing flight alone could save them. But the sky does not forgive belief without armor. By the first months of 1945, the G4M was a ghost. Its long wings still gleamed in photographs, but the men who flew them called it a death sentence with propellers. Every sortie felt like a lottery. The odds were so poor that some crews gave their planes nicknames like Requiem, Spirit of Smoke, or Last Light. Others didn't bother naming them at all. They knew they'd be gone in a week. The Japanese Navy tried to evolve. They stripped the Betty of its heavy guns, reinforced the bomb bay for larger payloads, and even tested armor plates around the cockpit. None of it mattered. Allied fighters now prowled every sky from the Philippines to Okinawa. The Betty's advantage, range, no longer guaranteed escape. Fuel shortages limited training. Spare parts vanished. Crews were young, barely competent flying aircraft that were masterpieces of efficiency in a world that no longer needed efficiency, only endurance. Intelligence intercepts confirmed how grim it had become. Translated radio messages from surviving units were curt and fatalistic. Mission completed, aircraft aflame, goodbye. Entire squadrons disappeared. Commanders responded not by questioning doctrine, but by glorifying sacrifice. "To die in a Betty is honor," one dispatch read. "To die in flames is light for the Emperor." The Americans who read those intercepts at Pearl Harbor couldn't decide whether to feel pity or disbelief. They knew the plane was obsolete. They had the Wright Field data, the film of those wing panels bursting into fire. To them, sending men out in that aircraft was an act of deliberate cruelty. Still, the Betty refused to vanish quietly. In April 1945, off Okinawa, 2 G4Ms managed a low-level torpedo attack against the destroyer Hutchins. One torpedo struck home before both aircraft disintegrated in gunfire. The survivors in the water were silent as American sailors pulled them aboard. They looked stunned, one medic recalled, like they couldn't believe they were alive. Those prisoners confirmed what intelligence had suspected for months. The Betty's design had never changed at its core. "We knew," one pilot said during interrogation. "Every crew knew. But the G4M was the only bomber with the legs to reach the Americans. The command said armor would ruin it. They called it purity of flight. Back at Wright Field, that phrase stuck. Purity of flight. The idea that speed and distance could compensate for fragility was both poetic and insane. It echoed in every technical meeting, every lecture on aircraft survivability. Engineers began to use the Betty as shorthand for a fatal design compromise. On the chalkboards of aeronautical classrooms, instructors drew its fuel system as a cautionary tale. "This is how not to build a bomber," they said. "This is how you lose a war with math." As the Japanese homeland came under siege, Bettys were assigned to Special Attack Corps. The unarmored wings that had once carried torpedoes now held bombs or explosive-filled fuselages. They took off from Kyushu in the dawn mist, climbing toward fleets bristling with radar and anti-aircraft guns. Few reached their targets intact. American gunners learned to recognize the distinctive long green fuselage and the shimmering fire that followed when shells tore into it. "They come apart like tinfoil," one sailor wrote. "You hit them once, and they turn into falling suns." By mid-1945, there were only a few hundred airworthy Bettys left. They were used mostly for transport, ferrying officers, supplies, or wounded men between airfields that were themselves under attack. One of those flights would become infamous, the final mission of the war. On August 19, 1945, a white-painted Betty took off from an airfield near Tokyo, bearing emissaries of the Japanese government to negotiate the terms of surrender. Its fuselage was painted in white with green crosses. An American P-38S escorted it to the Philippines. Photographs of that flight circulated worldwide. For many, the symbolism was unmistakable. The very aircraft that had once carried destruction to Pearl Harbor's waters now carried surrender. When the emissaries stepped out at Ishima Airfield, American officers inspected the plane with quiet awe. They ran their hands over the thin aluminum, the empty gun mounts, the unarmored cockpit. "It's like a ghost of another world," one said. The last active Betty had flown not to fight, but to end the war it had helped begin. After the surrender, U.S. occupation forces scoured Japanese air bases for surviving aircraft. They found burned-out hulks, twisted spars, rows of wings stacked like scrap metal. Among them were dozens of G4Ms, their graceful lines still visible beneath soot and rust. Intelligence teams documented everything: fuel systems, electrical layouts, production techniques. They confirmed what Wright Field had already known. Japan had the engineering talent to build advanced machines, but not the industrial depth to protect them. Factory documents recovered from Mitsubishi's Nagoya plant told the story clearly. In 1940, engineers had proposed 3 prototypes for the Navy's long-range bomber requirement. One had self-sealing tanks and heavier structure. It was rejected for being too heavy. The chosen design, the prototype that became the G4M, met every performance requirement on paper, and none of the survivability ones. The Navy's own notes stated proudly, "Fuel efficiency and range are absolute priorities. Protection will be handled by tactical doctrine." It had worked for a season, then cost them everything. In 1946, the last intact Betty in American hands was moved from Wright Field to the Smithsonian Storage Facility in Maryland. The aluminum skin, so delicate it dented under fingertips, gleamed under warehouse lights. Technicians debated whether to preserve it. "It's beautiful," one said, "but it's also a warning." They left it crated, labeled Japanese G4M-1, recovered Guadalcanal, 1943. That crate still exists. The aircraft was never restored for public display, partly because curators couldn't decide how to tell its story. The Betty wasn't a symbol of triumph or innovation. It was a symbol of tragedy disguised as progress. A generation later, engineers studying post-war air combat would revisit the data. They concluded that the Betty's vulnerability was more than a design flaw. It was a mirror reflecting Japan's entire wartime mindset, overreach built on faith in speed, not sustainability. It wasn't ignorance, it was hubris, written in aluminum. In the end, the Betty's unprotected fuel tanks had done more than doom its crews. They had exposed the fatal weakness of a doctrine that worshipped reach but ignored resilience. The war ended, but the lesson outlasted it.